That's all it takes sometimes, isn't it? One word, one door opening, and behind it, something you weren't quite prepared for. My name doesn't matter much. What matters is that you're here, and I'm rather glad you are. Because the story I want to tell you today, well, it's not the kind you forget easily. It has the sea in it, and a dinner table, and a woman with very beautiful manners and very cold eyes. It is, at its heart, a story about a conversation, but not just any conversation. This one was quiet, civilized even. There was good wine, there were candles, and sitting across the table, in a lavender cardigan with her knitting in her lap and her white hair slightly out of place from the coastal wind, was Miss Jane Marple. Retired, elderly, tired, if she was honest. And yet, across from her sat a murderer, smiling, perfectly composed, utterly certain she had gotten away with it. She hadn't. The story is called A Conversation with a Killer. If you enjoy mysteries told the old way, slowly, carefully, with a cup of tea going cold on the side, then stay. I think you'll find this one rather worth your while. And if this is your first time here, do consider coming back. There are more stories where this one came from. The dark, quiet, very English kind. Now then, shall we begin? The Dead Man by the Sea. The body was found on a Tuesday. Not that the day of the week mattered particularly. Death, in Miss Marple's considerable experience, had very little respect for the calendar. It arrived when it chose to, and it left behind whatever mess it felt was appropriate. But Tuesday did seem somehow a rather undignified day to die. Not a Monday, which might suggest one had been building towards something. Not a Friday, which at least carried with it the faint romance of a week's end. Tuesday was simply Tuesday. Grey, unremarkable, and in the seaside town of Whitmore-on-Sea, perpetually damp. Miss Marple had been in Whitmore-on-Sea for 4 days when it happened. She had come, as her doctor had rather firmly suggested, for the air. Sea air, Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock had said. Oh, with that particular tone, he reserved for patients who argued too much. A fortnight. No murders, no mysteries, no involving yourself in things that are absolutely none of your business. He had looked at her over his spectacles when he said the last part, and she had smiled back at him in the way she always did, pleasantly, and with no intention whatsoever of making any promises. She was staying at a small guest house called the Moorings, run by a Mrs. Fellows, who was the sort of woman who starched her curtains and asked far too many questions at breakfast. The room was on the first floor, with a window that looked out over the harbour. And on clear mornings, which were not frequent, you could see the water turn a quite lovely shade of pale green before the clouds came back in. It was not a clear morning when they found Sir Edmund. The Miss Marple had woken at 6:30, as she always did, and had sat for a moment on the edge of her bed collecting herself. This took slightly longer than it used to. Her hip had been troublesome in the night, the damp most likely, and she had slept poorly, which left her with that particular variety of tiredness that a cup of tea helps but does not entirely cure. She dressed carefully, as was her habit, pinned her hair. It took 3 attempts to get it right, which was annoying, and made her way downstairs. Mrs. Fellows had set breakfast in the small dining room that looked out onto the street. There were 2 other guests, a retired schoolmaster named Mr. Albright, who read his newspaper with aggressive concentration and never initiated conversation, and a young woman called Patricia Vane, who was there painting watercolours of the harbour, and who seemed perfectly nice, but talked rather a great deal about colour theory. Miss Marple had her tea. The first cup was always the most important, and a piece of toast, and was beginning to feel something approaching human again when she heard it. Voices outside. Raised ones, not arguing exactly. More the particular pitch of people who have seen something they don't know what to do with. She set down her cup. Mr. Albright lowered his newspaper half an inch and looked towards the window. Patricia Vane stopped mid-sentence about cerulean blue. A moment later, Mrs. Fellows appeared in the doorway, her face very white, her hands clasped together in the way of someone who wants to appear calm and has not quite managed it. "I'm afraid," she said, "there's been some trouble down at the shore." Miss Marple did not hurry. Hurrying, at her age, was rarely useful and frequently undignified. But she did. Once she had put on her coat and found her walking stick, it had slid behind the umbrella stand again, which was a nuisance. Make her way down to the seafront with a certain quiet purposefulness. Whitmore-on-Sea was not a large town. It had one main street that curved gently down towards the harbour, a handful of shops, 2 public houses, a church with a stubborn damp patch on its north wall, and the particular atmosphere of an English seaside town in the off-season, which is to say, it felt faintly as though it had been built for a crowd that had not yet arrived, or perhaps had already gone home. The shore itself was shingle rather than sand, which gave it a grey, honest sort of look. At high tide, and the waves came quite close to the old sea wall. At low tide, there were rock pools. It was at the base of the sea wall, just where the shingle gave way to the larger rocks that jutted out towards the water, that Sir Edmund Harcourt had been found. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the small crowd that had gathered and looked. He was lying on his back. He was dressed in a good overcoat, dark wool, well cut, and his walking stick was some feet away, as though it had been dropped rather than placed. He was a large man, or had been, broad-shouldered, with a heavy, distinguished face that even now, in death, retained a certain air of authority. His white hair was wet from the morning spray. He was, without any question, dead. Constable Norris, a young man with red ears who seemed to be hoping someone more senior would arrive soon, was keeping the small crowd back with more determination than success. A fisherman named Tresco, who had found the body on his way down to his boat, was standing to one side looking troubled. 2 women from the town were whispering to each other with their arms folded. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply looked. Sir Edmund Harcourt had moved to Whitmore-on-Sea approximately 6 months ago. She had already learned from Mrs. Fellows, who considered it her duty to brief new guests on all relevant town history over their first evening's dinner. He had taken Heron Lodge, the large house on the cliff road, slightly outside town, and had lived there quietly, or so it appeared, with a housekeeper and occasional visits from what Mrs. Fellows described as rather smart people from London. He had been a judge, retired now, of course, circuit judge for many years, a respectable career, well regarded. Mrs. Fellows had seemed proud to have such a man in the town, in the way that small towns sometimes are proud of their most distinguished residents, the way they might be proud of a particularly fine church window. Miss Marple had listened to all of this and said very little. She had, however, noticed, because she always noticed, the slight pause Mrs. Fellows had made before the word quietly, as though she had considered another word first and decided against it. Natural causes, most likely, she heard Constable Norris say to the fisherman in the tone of someone who very much hoped this was true. Old gentleman, out for an early walk. Perhaps his heart. Miss Marple looked at Sir Edmund's hands. His right hand was partially closed, the fingers curled slightly inward. There was nothing in it, but there was a small abrasion on the palm, faint, easily missed, of the sort one gets when one grabs at something rough and it is pulled away. She looked at the walking stick lying several feet away. She looked at the angle of the body, the way it lay, not as one falls when one simply collapses, but with a certain resistance, she thought, as though something had been struggled against. She looked at his face, and she thought, not for the first time in her long life, and with no particular satisfaction, no, not natural causes. She did not say this aloud. There was no one here yet worth saying it to. And besides, she was tired. Her hip was aching, and Dr. Hayduk had specifically told her. She almost smiled. No, he had told her to rest. He had not, technically, told her not to think. And thinking, in the end, was rather the thing she did best. She turned, slowly, and made her way back up the shingle towards the sea wall, her stick pressing small dents into the grey stones as she went. The wind off the water was cold and smelled of salt and seaweed and something else. Something that might have been rain coming in from the west. Behind her, she could hear Constable Norris on his telephone, speaking in a low, worried voice to someone at the station. Above her, on the cliff road, she could just make out the outline of Heron Lodge against the pale morning sky. She thought about a retired judge, about Ras, about the sort of man who might, in the course of a long career, collect enemies the way other men collect debts, quietly and with compound interest. She thought about the word quietly and the pause that had come before it. Then she went back to the moorings and had a second cup of tea, because there was nothing useful to be done before the proper authorities arrived, and because truly her hip hurt rather a great deal this morning, and some things, even for Miss Marple, simply had to wait. The woman in blue. She saw her for the first time that same afternoon. Miss Marple had spent the morning hours doing what she always did when she was thinking seriously about something. She sat in the small residence lounge of the moorings with her knitting, and appeared to any casual observer to be doing absolutely nothing of consequence. Mrs. Fellows brought her a second cup of tea at 10:30 and a third at 11, and each time glanced at the knitting, with the faint bewilderment of a woman who had never understood why anyone would make something by hand that could perfectly well be purchased in a shop. Miss Marple thanked her pleasantly and said nothing of any importance, which Mrs. Fellows found vaguely disappointing, as she had been hoping for conversation, and the news had moved through Whitmore-on-Sea the way news always moves through small towns, faster than feet, slower than telephone, and slightly distorted at every stage of the journey. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had heard 3 versions of events from Mrs. Fellows alone. In the first, Sir Edmund had slipped on the wet rocks in the dark, and it was a terrible tragedy. In the second, his heart had given out, and the doctor had apparently said as much, though Mrs. Fellows could not say which doctor. In the third, delivered in a lower voice, with the dining room door pulled nearly closed, there were those who were saying it might not have been an accident at all. And wasn't it dreadful? And what was the world coming to? If Miss Marple listened to all 3 versions with equal attention and equal composure, and knitted through all of them without dropping a stitch. By noon, a detective inspector had arrived from the county town, a man called Ramsay, whom Miss Marple had not met and could not yet form a view of. She had seen him briefly from the window of the lounge, getting out of a black car with the slightly pressed look of a man who had been pulled away from something else and was not entirely pleased about it. He had gone directly to the shore and had not, as yet, come to the moorings. Miss Marple did not find this surprising. She was, after all, simply an elderly lady on holiday. For the moment, that suited her perfectly. It was at 2:15 that she first saw Mrs. Vivian Ashworth. Miss Marple had decided, after a light lunch, to take a short walk. Her hip was still unhappy about the morning's exertion, but she had found over many years that sitting still too long made it worse rather than better. And besides, she wanted to look at the town properly. Not the seafront, not yet, but the streets, the shops, the small geography of the place. In Miss Marple's experience, you could learn a very great deal about a community simply by walking through it slowly and paying attention. People did not notice old ladies walking slowly. They moved around them, or past them, or simply stopped seeing them altogether. This was, she had long ago decided, one of the more useful things about being old. She had made her way up the main street, past the post office and the chemist's, and a small tea room that smelled promisingly of baking, and had stopped for a moment outside the harbour master's office to look at a notice board. Tide Times, a lost cat, a forthcoming church sale, when she heard a voice behind her. Not directed at her, just present, the way some voices are. Yes, it's simply dreadful. I can hardly believe it still. Low, warm, with a particular quality of controlled emotion that Miss Marple's ear caught at once, not because it was false, exactly, but because it was considered. Like a note played on a very well-tuned instrument by someone who knew precisely how much pressure to apply. She did not turn immediately. She adjusted her gloves instead, with the unhurried movements of a woman who had lost a button, and let her eyes move sideways. There were two women standing a little way up the pavement, outside the door of what appeared to be a small antique shop. One was a woman Miss Marple recognized vaguely from the harbour that morning, stout, with a sensible coat and the permanently anxious expression of someone who serves on too many local committees. The other was quite different. She was perhaps 40, or a well-preserved 45. Tall, with the kind of slender figure that speaks of either natural good fortune or considerable discipline. Miss Marple suspected the latter. She wore a blue coat of excellent cut, a shade between cornflower and the sea on a grey day, with a narrow belt that emphasized a waist that had no need of emphasizing. Her dark hair was neat beneath a small hat that managed to be both fashionable and restrained. Her gloves were cream. She was, in the most precise sense of the word, elegant. I spoke to him only last week, she was saying to the woman in the sensible coat. At the Henderson supper, he seemed perfectly well, perfectly himself. She paused and pressed her lips together briefly. These things are such a shock. The woman in the sensible coat agreed that they were, and added something about his heart. And the woman in the blue coat, Mrs. Vivian Ashworth, though Miss Marple did not yet know her name, nodded slowly, with an expression of such composed, graceful sorrow that it would have moved anyone watching. Miss Marple watched, and thought how very carefully that grief has been arranged. She found out the name an hour later, back at the moorings, over the rather good seed cake that Mrs. Fellows had produced for afternoon tea. Mrs. Ashworth? Mrs. Fellows brightened considerably at the question, in the way of a woman who has been waiting to discuss exactly this subject. Oh yes, she's been here. 2 years now, perhaps a little more. Came after her husband died. Dreadful business that. He was much older than her, of course. Nearly 20 years, I should think. And his heart was never strong. She took the house on Saltings Lane, the one with the blue shutters, terribly suitable, everyone said, and she's made it perfectly lovely inside, I'm told, though I haven't seen it myself. Miss Marple accepted a slice of seed cake and said encouragingly, she seemed a very composed sort of person. "Oh, very," said Mrs. Fellows, with a slight emphasis that suggested she found this composure faintly suspicious, without being able to say why. "Very composed. He always perfectly turned out. Very friendly with everyone, if you know what I mean. Knew Sir Edmund, of course. Most of the better sort of people in the town did. He had people to dinner quite regularly, apparently, at Heron Lodge. Mrs. Ashworth was there often." "Often?" said Miss Marple. "So, I understand." A small pause. Mrs. Fellows refilled her own teacup. "Of course," she added, with the careful neutrality of a woman who has an opinion she is not quite prepared to state directly, "she is a widow, and he was a widower. One doesn't like to speculate." "No," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "one doesn't." That evening she sat by her window, as the light went out of the sky over the harbour, her knitting in her lap and the day's impressions arranging themselves, slowly, in her mind. She thought about Sir Edmund Harcourt, or a judge. A man who had, in the ordinary course of his professional life, made decisions, verdicts, sentences, rulings that had altered the course of other people's lives. Sometimes justly, sometimes, and this was the thing about power, Miss Marple had always felt, sometimes not. Power was rarely as clean as the people who held it liked to believe. She thought about the hand on the shingle, the walking stick too far away, the angle of the fall. She thought about a woman in a blue coat with cream gloves and a grief that had been arranged. There was a word that kept coming back to her, and it was not a dramatic word. It was simply familiar. The woman had looked at the situation, the questions, the condolences, the soft performance of communal shock, with the ease of someone who was not surprised by any of it, who had been here, it in some form, before. Miss Marple had known women like that. Not many, but enough. In St. Mary Mead, there had been a woman, years ago this was, who had poisoned 2 husbands and a brother-in-law, and had sat through the funeral of each of them with exactly that expression. Sorrowful, lovely, and absolutely steady. She had eventually been caught because of a detail so small, the way she had stirred her tea at the second husband's wake, that no one else had noticed it at all. Miss Marple had noticed it. She was not, she reminded herself, jumping to conclusions. She was simply paying attention. Which was what she did. Which was, perhaps, what she had always done best. She looked down at her knitting. She had dropped a stitch sometime in the last row without noticing. That was the hip's fault. Or perhaps the tiredness, and she worked it back carefully, her fingers moving in the familiar rhythm. Outside, the sea made its constant indifferent sound against the shingle. Mrs. Vivian Ashworth, she thought, a widow, elegant, composed, often at Heron Lodge, familiar with a dead man's company. And those eyes, she came back to the eyes. She had only glimpsed them for a moment, from a distance, but there had been something in them that she couldn't quite set aside. Not hardness precisely. Hardness was too crude a word. More like clarity, the kind that comes not from innocence, but from decision, from having looked at something difficult and chosen, quite deliberately, what to do about it. Miss Marple had seen that clarity before too. She picked up her dropped stitch and carried on. Tomorrow, she thought, I shall find a reason to meet her properly. Dinner at the Gull and Crown. The invitation, such as it was, came about entirely by accident. Or at least, it appeared to. Miss Marple had learned, over a long lifetime of observing human nature in all its varieties, that the most useful social opportunities were rarely the ones you arranged deliberately. Deliberate arrangements had a way of putting people on their guard. They arrived prepared, with their answers already sorted, and their expressions decided upon in advance. It was the accidental encounter, the unplanned conversation, the chance seating at a shared table. These were the moments when people forgot, just briefly, to be careful. She had therefore spent the morning of Wednesday in a manner calculated to appear entirely without calculation. She had walked along the main street. She had gone into the small tea room and had a very decent pot of Darjeeling. She had gone into the lending library and spent 40 minutes browsing the shelves, which she genuinely enjoyed, and had come out with an Ngaio marsh she hadn't read and a clearer picture of the town's rhythms than she had had before. She had not seen Mrs. Ashworth in the morning, but she had heard her mentioned twice. Once by the woman at the post office, who said something about Vivian being terribly brave about the whole business, and once, more interestingly, by a young woman at the chemist's who had said in a lowered voice to a colleague, not knowing Miss Marple was standing 2 feet away examining cough lozenges, that she thought it was a bit strange, wasn't it? How calm she was, and that her mother had always said there was something not quite. Before she had looked up, seen Miss Marple, and stopped. Miss Marple had purchased her cough lozenges and said nothing, but she filed it away. The way she filed everything. The Gull and Crown was the better of Whitmer-on-Sea's 2 public houses, better in the sense that it served hot food in the evenings and had tablecloths. It occupied the ground floor of what had once been a customs house, and it retained a certain low-ceilinged, stone-floored solidity that made it feel, even on a damp Wednesday evening, pleasantly inhabited. There were dark beams overhead, a fireplace that was actually lit, and a smell of wood smoke and something savoury from the kitchen that Miss Marple found immediately welcoming. She had come because Mrs. Fellows had mentioned that the Gull and Crown did a reliable lamb chop on Wednesdays. And because Miss Marple had found over many years that thinking was always improved by a good dinner. She had not known that several other people in the town had had the same idea. The room was perhaps half full when she arrived at 7 o'clock. A young couple near the window. 3 men at the bar with the ease of long habit. And at a round table near the fire, a small group who had clearly come together, 4 of them with wine already open. Mrs. Vivian Ashworth was among them. She was sitting with her back half turned to the room, in profile, wearing something dark, navy perhaps or very deep grey, with a single strand of pearls, and she was laughing quietly at something the man beside her had said. A heavy-set man in his 50s with a red face and the jovial manner of someone who laughs easily and means very little by it. Miss Marple was shown to a table near the wall, not far from the fire, accepted the menu, ordered the lamb, and opened her Ngaio marsh. She did not look at the table by the fire more than once every several minutes. This was enough. It was the pale young man who came to her first. He had got up, to go to the bar apparently, and on his way back had stopped with the uncertain expression of someone who has recognized a face, but cannot immediately place it. "Forgive me. Are you staying at the moorings?" "I am, yes. I thought so. My aunt mentioned you. I'm Edward Collier." He offered a hand. "I grew up here. I'm back for the business with Sir Edmund. He was a friend of my father's." "I'm so sorry," said Miss Marple, with genuine sympathy. "It must be a difficult time." "It is." A pause. "Would you care to join us? It seems a shame to sit alone. We're a very informal gathering. Just a few people who knew Sir Edmund." Miss Marple looked at him for a moment. Then she closed her book. "How very kind," she said. "I should like that very much." The introductions were made with the ease of people making the best of an awkward week. The gardening woman was Mrs. Ruth Henderson, and her husband, the red-faced man, was Gerald, a retired civil engineer who filled silences cheerfully and meant very little by any of it. Miss Marple decided within 4 minutes that he was almost entirely harmless. Mrs. Henderson was less easy to read. She spoke carefully and with a quiet warmth, the warmth of someone who had genuinely valued Sir Edmund and was privately, simply grieved. Edward Collier said very little about Sir Edmund at all. And then there was Vivian. She turned when Miss Marple was introduced and smiled, warmly, naturally, with both the correct degree of welcome and the correct degree of restraint. Her eyes were grey-green. Her handshake was firm without being assertive. Her voice had that same quality Miss Marple had noticed on the pavement, low, warm, and somehow considered. "How lovely that you could join us," she said. And it sounded entirely sincere. And Miss Marple smiled back and thought, there it is again, that note, played with just the right pressure. "Have you been in Whitmore-on-Sea long?" Vivian asked, with the easy manner of a woman entirely comfortable with social conversation. "Only since Saturday," said Miss Marple. "My doctor sent me for the sea air. I'm afraid I'm at the age where one's doctor sends one places." She said this with a self-deprecating smile that invited others to dismiss her as pleasantly as they liked. Several people had over the years. It was always useful. Vivian smiled. "And are you finding it restful?" "In spite of everything, I find the sea very clarifying," said Miss Marple. "One thinks more clearly near the water. I've always felt that." Something very small, very briefly, moved in those grey-green eyes. Then it was gone. "Yes," said Vivian, "I've always thought so too." Dinner arrived, and then the conversation moved as dinner conversations do. From Sir Edmund's death to the inadequacy of Constable Norris, to Inspector Ramsay, to the general state of the town. Miss Marple ate her lamb chop, which was very good, and participated just enough to remain present without becoming the centre of anything. She asked gentle questions. She laughed at the correct moments. She was, in every visible respect, a pleasant, slightly tired elderly lady enjoying a sociable evening. All the while, she was listening, not to what people said, to how they said it. Gerald Henderson talked about Sir Edmund with the ease of a man who had liked him straightforwardly. Mrs. Henderson talked about him with careful warmth, affection combined with something slightly guarded, as though she had known things about the man she had chosen to set aside. But Edward Collier talked about him very little, and Vivian talked about him with perfect grace. The right stories, the right fondness, the right regret. She referred to him as Edmund, familiarly, but not excessively so. She said once with a slight smile that he had been rather a difficult man to argue with, and everyone made the sound of people recognizing something true. But Miss Marple noticed, she nearly always noticed, the precise word chosen. Not stubborn, not opinionated, not any of the dozen words one might use about a man one had simply disagreed with over dinner. Difficult to argue with, the word of someone who had argued with him. Seriously, about something that mattered. She filed that away too. By the time the plates were cleared and coffee ordered, Mrs. Henderson had gone to speak to someone across the room, and Gerald was deep in conversation with Edward, which left, for a few minutes, only Miss Marple and Vivian at the table. Miss Marple refilled her tea and said, in a tone of simple conversational curiosity, "Did you know him well, Sir Edmund?" Vivian turned her wineglass slowly by its stem. "Reasonably well. As well as one knows anyone here. It's a small town, and people tend to see the same faces." A slight pause. "He was interesting company, intelligent, not always easy, as I said, but interesting." "I imagine a man with his career would have many stories," said Miss Marple. all those years on the bench?" "I imagine so." Something faintly careful entered the tone, like a person choosing their next step on uncertain ground. "Did he ever speak of his work? His cases?" Vivian looked at her then, directly, if for just a fraction longer than was entirely casual. "Sometimes," she said, "in general terms. He was rather private about the specifics." "Of course," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Quite right, too." She smiled and picked up her teacup, and the moment passed. But in that fraction of a second, that half-beat of a look, something had shifted. Vivian Ashworth was not accustomed to being questioned. Not by anyone she had already assessed as unthreatening. The question had surprised her. Faintly, barely perceptibly, but enough. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Good," she thought. "Now we know where the edge is." She walked back to the moorings alone, her stick on the wet pavement and the sound of the sea somewhere below in the darkness. Her hip ached. She was genuinely tired, the deep tiredness of a woman who had been concentrating very hard for several hours, while appearing to concentrate on nothing at all. It was, she sometimes thought, the most exhausting kind of work. But underneath the tiredness, she was certain. Not of the details, not yet. But certain that Vivian Ashworth had known Sir Edmund in a way that went considerably beyond neighbourhood acquaintance. She had known him in the way of someone who had something at stake, something that mattered. And Sir Edmund Harcourt had not slipped on the rocks. Miss Marple went upstairs to bed and was asleep within 10 minutes. The sea went on making its sound, and the town of Whitmore-on-Sea was quiet and dark, and whatever the truth was, it was patient. It had, after all, been waiting here all along. The knitting needle. No, it rained on Thursday. Not the half-hearted, apologetic rain of a town that hasn't quite decided, but the real kind, the kind that comes in off the sea with intention and settles in for the day. By 8 in the morning, the harbour was invisible behind it, and the gulls, which had been noisy since dawn, had gone wherever gulls go, when even they have had enough. Miss Marple sat in the residence lounge of the moorings, with her knitting, and listened to it against the windows and felt, on the whole, that it suited her purposes rather well. Rain kept people indoors. Indoors, people talked. She had come down to breakfast earlier than usual. Her hip had woken her at 5, and she had given up on sleep by 6, which was annoying, but not, she supposed, entirely without use. And she had eaten her toast and drunk her tea, and had been in the lounge by 8:30. Settled in the chair nearest the window, with a clear view of both the door and the small side table where Mrs. Fellows left the morning newspaper, and had been there quietly when the other guests drifted in and out. Mr. Albright had taken his newspaper and retreated. Patricia Vane had appeared briefly, looked at the rain with the expression of someone whose entire day had just been cancelled, and had gone back upstairs with the air of a woman composing a letter of complaint to the weather. At 9:30, Mrs. Fellows had appeared to say that a Mrs. Ashworth had telephoned. She had got the number from Edward Collier, apparently, and had asked whether Miss Marple might like to join her for coffee that morning, or as she lived only a short walk from the seafront, and it seemed a shame to be indoors alone on such a dreadful day. Miss Marple had looked up from her knitting. "How very thoughtful," she said. "Please do tell her. I should be delighted." The house on Saltings Lane was exactly as Mrs. Fellows had described. Blue shutters, a small front garden that had been planted with the kind of considered simplicity that takes a good deal of effort to achieve. A brass knocker in the shape of an anchor that had been polished to a quiet gleam. The kind of house, Miss Marple thought, as she stood at the door with her umbrella dripping and her coat damp at the shoulders. That told you a great deal about its occupant before you had even gone inside. Everything chosen, everything controlled, nothing accidental. Vivian answered the door herself, which suggested either no housekeeper or a housekeeper who had been given the morning off. And both possibilities were interesting. "Miss Marple, please come in, you must be soaked. Let me take your coat." The interior was warm and smelled faintly of something expensive. Not perfume exactly, but the particular scent of a house that has been arranged with taste and maintained with care. The hall was narrow but not cramped, with pale walls and a dark wooden floor and a small table on which sat a single vase of white tulips. Not a bunch, a vase, considered. Miss Marple surrendered her coat and her umbrella and followed Vivian through to a sitting room at the back of the house that looked out onto a small walled garden, currently receiving the rain with philosophical resignation. The room was lovely, and Miss Marple took it in quietly as she settled into the chair she was offered. A good chair, upholstered in something soft and grey, positioned near a low fire. Bookshelves along one wall, a writing desk near the window, tidy but not empty, papers, a pen, a small leather diary that had been closed but not put away. 2 paintings on the walls, both seascapes, both originals, and both rather good. And on the mantelpiece, among several small objects arranged with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, a framed photograph. Miss Marple looked at it for a moment, casually, as one looks at things in other people's rooms. A man and a woman, standing on what appeared to be a terrace somewhere, summer, with the easy posture of people comfortable in each other's company. The man was tall, broad, and with a large distinguished face. Older than the woman beside him by some margin, Sir Edmund Harcourt and Vivian, younger in the photograph, perhaps 2 years, perhaps 3. Laughing with the natural ease of someone who does not know the photograph is being taken, or has forgotten to care. "Coffee," said Vivian, coming in from the kitchen with a tray, and Miss Marple moved her eyes smoothly away from the mantelpiece and arranged her knitting in her lap. "How kind," she said. "What a lovely room this is." They began, as such conversations must, with the weather and the town, and the general sadness of the week. Vivienne poured coffee. Real coffee, not the instant variety, as strong and dark with a small jug of cream, and sat across from Miss Marple, in the other fireside chair, with the practiced ease of a woman entirely at home in her own drawing room. She asked with apparent interest about St. Mary Mead. She asked about Miss Marple's doctor and his prescription of sea air, and laughed softly at the description of Dr. Haydock's expression. She was warm, attentive, and asked exactly the right number of questions. Not so many as to seem intrusive, not so few as to seem indifferent. She was, Miss Marple thought, watching her knit with a mild and pleasant expression, extraordinarily good at this. "You must miss it," Vivian said. "Your village when you're away." "In some ways," said Miss Marple, "but one finds, I think, that human nature is much the same wherever one is. The sea changes, the houses change, our people not so very much." Vivian smiled. "That's rather a wise observation." "Not especially," said Miss Marple modestly. "It's simply something one notices at my age. One has seen rather a lot of situations repeated in one form or another." A brief pause, just brief enough to be a pause. "I imagine," said Vivian, "that you've known a good deal of eventful lives, in a village I mean. These small communities can be terribly dramatic." "Oh, terribly," Miss Marple agreed with perfect cheerfulness. "You would be surprised. Or perhaps you wouldn't. A town like this has much the same quality, I should think. Everyone knowing everyone. All those overlapping histories." She said the last two words with the gentlest possible emphasis and let them settle, and picked up her knitting and said nothing further. If Vivian's expression did not change. But her right hand, which had been resting loosely on the arm of her chair, moved just slightly. A small, almost imperceptible shift. The kind of movement that means nothing and comes from nothing except a body registering something that the face has decided not to. Miss Marple counted her stitches. "Were you in Whitmore-on-Sea long before Sir Edmund arrived?" she asked, after a suitable interval filled with comfortable, inconsequential talk about the lending library and the best spots for walking when the weather permitted. "Yes, about 18 months before him, I think." Vivian refilled both their coffee cups with a steady hand. "He arrived last October. We met. Within the first week, I think. Small town." A slight smile. One meets everyone within the first week." "He must have been a considerable addition to local society." "He was, rather. A man of his background and experience. People were very interested in him. He could be tremendous company when he chose to be." When he chose to be. The qualification came naturally, smoothly, and was gone. "I understand he had quite a distinguished career," said Miss Marple. "The law, all those years of it?" "Yes, a long career." Something faintly careful entered the tone, like a person choosing their next step on uncertain ground. "He didn't talk about it a great deal. I think he found it. I think he was glad to be retired." "The weight of it, perhaps," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "All those decisions, all that responsibility. I imagine it stays with a person." "I imagine it does." The voice was steady. The coffee cup, however, had been set down on the saucer rather than held, returned to the table with the small deliberateness of someone who has decided their hands are better occupied with nothing at all. Miss Marple looked at the rain against the garden window and said mildly, pleasantly, as though the thought had simply occurred to her, "I knew a judge once, years ago, a friend of a friend, as one meets people in the country. A very capable man, very certain of himself, the way powerful men often are." She paused as though remembering. He had made a decision years before, in a serious case, that had not been, well, there were those who felt he had not been entirely fair. She shook her head gently. "These things are so difficult to judge, aren't they? From the outside." Silence, not an empty silence, a silence with something in it. Miss Marple continued to knit. Her eyes were on her work, and had been, she was reasonably sure, throughout. "Yes," said Vivian after a moment, "they are." Her voice was the same, warm, measured, composed, but something beneath it, some quality of ease, of the natural, unthinking comfort of a person in their own home, had altered. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to someone not specifically looking for it. But Miss Marple was specifically looking for it. "Of course," she said brightly, looking up. "I dare say most judges do their very best. It is an impossible position, really. One can only work with what one is given." "Yes," said Vivian. "One can only work with what one is given." She said it lightly and smiled, and Miss Marple smiled back, and they moved on to the subject of the church sale, and whether the forecast might improve by the weekend. But the words stayed in the room, Miss Marple felt, the way certain words do. 20 minutes passed, the fire settled, the rain continued. Miss Marple finished the row she was on, turned her work, and began a new one. She thought about what she knew. She knew, or suspected very strongly, which in her experience was often the same thing, that Vivian Ashworth's connection to Sir Edmund was not the simple neighbourly acquaintance she had described. The photograph on the mantelpiece. The familiar ease of Edmund spoken at dinner. The way she had been at Heron Lodge, often, as Mrs. Fellows had said, with that careful neutrality. She knew that Vivian had argued with him, seriously, about something that mattered enough to remember, but she knew that there was a history, some history, involving his career. A case, perhaps, something that had consequences. And she knew, with the particular certainty of a woman who had spent 80-odd years watching people behave under pressure, that Vivian Ashworth was, at this very moment, making calculations. Behind those grey-green eyes, behind the warmth and the coffee and the pleasant conversation about church sales, she was measuring. Deciding exactly how much Miss Marple knew, exactly what sort of person she was, exactly how much of a problem she presented. Which meant, Miss Marple thought, with a small private satisfaction, she had presented enough of one to be worth measuring. Good, she dropped a stitch. Genuinely, this time. Her fingers momentarily losing the thread, and made a small sound of irritation, and looked down at her work. "I do beg your pardon," she said. "I'm afraid I've made a muddle of this row. I'm not usually so careless. The damp gets into one's hands, I find." "Can I help at all?" asked Vivian, leaning forward slightly with an expression of polite concern. No, thank you. I can manage." Miss Marple worked the stitch back with slightly clumsy fingers and smiled apologetically. "There. Though I confess it's not my best work this week. I've been rather more distracted than usual." "By everything that has happened?" Vivian's tone was sympathetic, perfectly pitched. "Partly." Miss Marple looked up, and her expression was simply open. An old woman, candid, faintly troubled. "I suppose I have a tiresome habit, and my friends have always said of finding things difficult to leave alone when something doesn't seem quite right." She said it simply, without emphasis, and returned to her knitting. "I expect it is tiresome. One ought, at my age, to be able to let things alone. A beat. Then, what sort of things?" Vivian's voice was perfectly level. "Oh," Miss Marple waved a hand gently. "Details, small things, the sort that probably don't mean anything at all." She smiled, self-deprecatingly. "My niece says I see complications everywhere. She's probably right." Vivian looked at her for a long moment. It was the longest and most direct look she had given her since Miss Marple had arrived. There was something in it, assessing, careful, and behind the assessment, something else. Something coiled and quiet and very, very still. "I'm sure your niece is right," she said pleasantly. "Some things really are as simple as they appear." "Oh, quite," said Miss Marple. "Quite." She smiled warmly and turned another row, and did I not look up, and thought, "No, they are not. And you know that I know that. And now we both know where we are." She left at 12:30, with her coat dried and her umbrella reshouldered, and Vivian's warm goodbye at the door. Perfectly genuine sounding, perfectly correct. They parted with every appearance of having had a thoroughly pleasant morning. Miss Marple walked back along Saltings Lane in the rain, which had eased to a fine grey drizzle, and did not think about the conversation because she had already been thinking about it for the last 2 hours while conducting it, and there was for the moment nothing more to think, and she thought instead about the photograph on the mantelpiece, about the angle of two people standing together, about the particular quality of Vivian's laugh in it, unguarded, real, belonging to a woman who had once, apparently, been happy in this man's presence, which made everything, if anything, more complicated. Not simpler, never simpler. Miss Marple had found over many years of looking into dark corners that the most dangerous people were rarely the ones who had never felt anything. They were the ones who had then been failed or betrayed or wronged, and had decided quietly and with great precision to do something about it. Emotion did not make people irrational. Sometimes it made them extraordinarily coldly focused. She turned up the collar of her coat against the drizzle. The knitting needles knew, as she thought, an old habit of thought, half superstition, wholly private. Somewhere in the rhythm of those rows and stitches, in the small automatic work of her hands that freed her mind to move, the shape of a thing took form. Not facts, not proof, just shape. And the shape of this thing was becoming, stitch by stitch, row by row, terribly clear. A crack in the china. The rain cleared on Friday morning. It did so in the way of English coastal weather, not gradually, not with any particular announcement, but simply as though someone had reached up and removed a grey cloth from the sky, leaving behind a pale, washed brightness that made the wet rooftops shine, and the harbour water look almost Mediterranean for approximately 40 minutes, before the clouds came back in, though thinner this time, and higher. Miss Marple noticed the improvement from her bedroom window at 7 o'clock and decided to take her morning walk earlier than usual. Her hip was better. Not good, it was rarely entirely good these days, but better, which was enough. She dressed, pinned her hair with only one false start, and was outside by 7:30 with her stick and her coat, and the particular quiet alertness of a woman who has slept on a problem and woken to find it slightly clearer than it had been the night before. She did not go to the seafront. She went instead up the hill road, the one that curved away from the main street and climbed gradually towards the cliff road, and, further along, to the gate of Heron Lodge. She was not going to Heron Lodge. She had no reason to, and no invitation. And it would have been both presumptuous and, more importantly, obvious. But the road that led to it was a public road, and walking along a public road was not a thing that required explanation. She walked slowly, as always. The road was quiet at this hour. A milk van coming down the hill in the other direction. There a man with a terrier who nodded at her in the brief, respectful way of early morning walkers. A blackbird singing from somewhere above the sea wall, with an extravagance that seemed, on reflection, fully justified. She stopped once, ostensibly to look at the view, the harbour below, the pale line of the sea, the town laid out in its small, self-contained way. And while she looked at the view, she was also, with the portion of her attention she could spare, looking at the road itself, at the verge, at the gate of Heron Lodge, which was visible from where she stood, perhaps 200 yards further on. There was a police car parked outside it, which was not surprising. Detective Inspector Ramsay would still be conducting his inquiries, and Heron Lodge was the dead man's house and the obvious place to conduct them. She had expected this. What she had not expected was the second car, a dark green motor car, not a police vehicle, parked on the verge a little way short of the gate, on the same side of the road as she was standing. She recognized it. She had seen it 2 evenings ago, outside the Gull and Crown. It belonged, she was fairly certain, to Edward Collier. She thought about that on the way back down the hill. Edward Collier, who had grown up here and come back for the business with Sir Edmund, who had said Sir Edmund was a friend of his father's, who had been at the dinner table at the Gull and Crown, with the careful, watchful expression of someone listening more than he appeared to. She thought about the way he had talked about Sir Edmund, or rather, the way he had not talked about him. The gaps, the short answers, and the careful expressions of appropriate regret that had not quite added up to grief. She thought about the way he had looked, once, across the table at Vivian. Just once, briefly, during a moment when Vivian had been talking about Sir Edmund with that particular, managed warmth. A look that had lasted less than a second and had said she was not entirely sure what it had said. Something complicated, something with history in it. She filed it away with everything else. It was at 11 o'clock that the crack appeared. She did not go looking for it. This was, she had always found, the important thing about cracks. You could not make them happen. You could only be present and attentive when they did. They had their own timing, their own private logic. All you could do was watch carefully and make sure you did not look away at the wrong moment. She was in the small tea room on the main street, the one that smelled of bacon, when Vivian came in. Miss Marple was sitting at a table near the back wall, with her tea and a scone she had not entirely meant to order but had not regretted, and her Ngaio Marsh, which she had been reading with genuine pleasure for perhaps 20 minutes. The tea room had 4 tables, all small, with blue checked cloths and a chalkboard menu by the door. A woman of about 60 ran it, assisted by a teenage girl who moved between the tables with the slightly distracted efficiency of someone doing 2 things at once. Vivian came in at 11, precisely. Miss Marple noted the time because she had just checked the small clock above the counter to see whether she had time for a second cup before she had intended to go out. Vivian was wearing a pale grey coat today, and her dark hair was slightly less perfectly arranged than it had been previously, a single strand out of place at the temple, which was, in itself, unremarkable. People's hair was disordered by the wind. This was not a thing that signified. But there was something else. Vivian stood in the doorway for a moment, just a moment, before she saw Miss Marple. And in that moment, before her eyes had found anyone she knew, and before her expression had therefore been composed for an audience, Miss Marple saw her face as it actually was. Tired. Not pleasantly tired. Not the tiredness of a busy week, the other kind, the deep, internal tiredness of someone who has been managing something very heavy for a long time and is finding it heavier than it was. The corners of the mouth very slightly down. The eyes, without their usual quality of alert, calibrated attention, just, for one unguarded second, simply tired. Then she saw Miss Marple, and it was gone. Miss Marple, how lovely! The smile arrived, warm and real-seeming. She crossed the room with her usual ease, and Miss Marple gestured to the chair opposite, and Vivian sat down and ordered tea from the girl, and was, within 30 seconds, entirely herself again. Almost. They talked for a few minutes about nothing of importance. The weather clearing, the view from the cliff road, whether the church sale was on Saturday or Sunday, neither of them was certain. Vivian's tea arrived. She lifted the cup, one drank and set it down, and in setting it down, it slipped. Not dramatically, not a spill. She caught it immediately, the cup returning to the saucer with a small, sharp click that was not quite the sound it should have been. A tiny sound, the kind that happens when one's hand is not quite as steady as usual. Vivian looked at the cup, then looked up, caught Miss Marple's eyes for one brief instant, and looked away again. "Clumsy," she said with a small, light laugh. "I haven't slept terribly well." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "I expect it's been a difficult week." "It has rather." She picked up the cup again, quite steadily now, and drank. Miss Marple turned a page of her book, which was still on the table, and said without looking up from it, "I understand the police have been at Heron Lodge again this morning." A pause. Very short. "Have they?" said Vivian. "I hadn't heard." Which was the crack? Not the slip of the cup. That was tiredness, and tiredness alone. Not the unguarded face in the doorway. That was simply a human moment, the kind anyone might have. But this small, precise untruth, delivered in a tone carefully calibrated to sound like casual ignorance. I hadn't heard. But Edward Collier's car had been parked on the cliff road at 7:30 that morning. And Vivian and Edward Collier knew each other, had known each other for some time, Miss Marple was now quite certain. And in a town this size, with a story this prominent and a police car parked outside the most talked-about house in the area, in a town this size, Vivian Ashworth would have heard. She would have heard before 9 o'clock, probably before 8. Miss Marple looked up from her book with an expression of gentle, mild interest. "I believe they're treating it rather more seriously than the initial impression," she said thoughtfully. "These things take time to establish, of course, the medical details and so on. But I understand." She paused, as though trying to remember where she had heard this, which was nowhere, because she was constructing it deliberately, like a careful woman laying out china on a table to see which piece the other person reaches for. "I understand there were some questions about the particular circumstances." Vivian said nothing. She drank her tea. She was quite steady. She looked out of the window at the street with a thoughtful expression. And when she looked back, her face was composed and her eyes were clear. But she didn't say, "What sort of questions?" She did not say, "Oh, really? What have they found?" She did not express the natural, spontaneous curiosity of someone who has just been told that a man she knew, a man whose death she has been publicly, gracefully grieving all week, is being looked at more carefully than first thought. She said nothing. And said nothing for precisely 3 seconds. Miss Marple counted them quietly, behind the mild expression of her face. Before she said in a tone of careful concern, "I suppose that's inevitable, isn't it, with someone of his prominence? One expects a thorough inquiry." "Quite," said Miss Marple. "Quite right." She returned to her book. "There," she thought. "That is what you are. Not the warmth, not the composure, not the lovely room and the white tulips and the very good coffee. This, a 3 seconds of silence where there should have been surprise. That is who you are." They finished their tea with every appearance of friendliness. Vivian spoke about a garden she had been meaning to put in along the back wall. Did Miss Marple think wisteria or clematis for a north-facing aspect? Miss Marple said wisteria was more forgiving, but clematis had the better range of colour, and they discussed this in some detail, and it was all very pleasant. At 12:15, they put on their coats and parted on the pavement outside the tea room, with warm smiles and a vague mention of perhaps seeing each other at the church sale, if either of them made it. Miss Marple watched Vivian walk away up the street. She walked, as always, beautifully, straight-backed, unhurried, with the natural confidence of a woman comfortable in her own body and her own choices. She turned the corner at the top of the street and was gone. Miss Marple stood for a moment on the pavement, her stick in hand, the mild coastal wind moving through the white hair that had come slightly loose from its pins again. It always did by midday, which was one of those small indignities one simply lived with. She thought about the 3 seconds of silence. She thought about a crack in a piece of china, the kind you didn't see until you held it up to the light. The kind that meant the piece was not, after all, entirely sound. The kind that, once you knew it was there, you could not unsee. She thought about Edward Collier's car on the cliff road, and the look across the dinner table, and the photograph on the mantelpiece, and a retired judge, with a long career and the particular sort of enemies that long careers in positions of power had a way of making. She thought about Vivian's question about wisteria and clematis, delivered with absolute composure not 4 minutes after the 3 seconds that had told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. That, she thought, was the most remarkable thing. Not the crack, the china around it, the extraordinary, disciplined, sustained wholeness of the rest of it. Most people, when frightened, and Vivian was frightened, Miss Marple was now quite certain of that. Beneath all of it she was frightened. Most people showed it in accumulating ways. Small failures of composure that built on each other. A slightly raised voice here, a slightly too quick answer there. The cracks multiplied. Vivian had shown one, the one small, precise crack, in a teacup in a tea room. And then she had put herself back together and discussed garden plants with the serenity of a woman who had nothing in the world to concern her. That was not the behavior of someone losing their nerve. That was the behavior of someone who had been in control of themselves for a very long time, in circumstances that required it, and who was going to go on being in control of themselves for as long as it took, which made her, Miss Marple thought, more dangerous, not less. She straightened her hat. The wind had shifted it again, which was exasperating, and began to walk back towards the moorings for lunch. She had one thought, clear and simple, that sat at the front of her mind and did not move. This cannot wait much longer. What the sea keeps. Saturday arrived with the particular stillness of a day that has not yet decided what it wants to be. The sky was neither clear nor clouded, a pale, even grey, like the inside of an oyster shell, with a thin light coming through it that made everything look slightly more deliberate than usual. The sea was calm, not the cheerful calm of a summer morning, but the heavier, older calm of deep water that has nothing to prove. The kind of calm that is not peace, but simply the absence, for the moment, of disturbance. Miss Marple noticed it from her window at 7 o'clock and thought, today. She did not know exactly what today would bring. That was not how it worked. But she had felt it before, this particular quality of a morning, and the way a situation that has been building and accumulating and gathering its weight finally reaches a point of readiness. Like a thing on a high shelf that has been moving, almost imperceptibly, towards the edge. Today, it would move far enough. She dressed with care. Not unusual care. She was always careful, but the particular kind of care that was, she supposed, a private acknowledgement of the importance of the day. Her best cardigan, the lavender one. Her hair pinned correctly on the first attempt, which was a mercy. Her stick by the door. She went downstairs and had her tea and her toast, and when Mrs. Fellowes came in with the second pot, and the expression of a woman who had heard something and was deciding how to present it, Miss Marple looked up and said pleasantly, "Is there news?" Mrs. Fellowes sat down, which she did not usually do at breakfast. "The inspector," she said, "Inspector Ramsay. Apparently he's been asking questions all over town. Since yesterday evening, they're saying." She paused. "About Mrs. Ashworth." "I see," said Miss Marple. "Apparently there was something about a letter, or letters, in Sir Edmund's desk at Heron Lodge." Mrs. Fellowes pressed her lips together with the expression of someone who has more information than they know how to classify. "I don't know the details, but people are saying there's talk of—" She stopped. "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "Well." Mrs. Fellowes straightened the already straight sugar bowl. It's all one wouldn't have thought, would one? She always seemed such a composed sort of person. Yes, said Miss Marple. She did. She found Detective Inspector Ramsay at 10:30. He was coming out of the harbour master's office with the slightly drained expression of a man who has been talking to many people for many hours, and has had rather less sleep than he would have liked. He was younger than she had thought from a distance, mid-40s perhaps, with a thin face and careful eyes, and the look of a man who was, beneath the tiredness, genuinely capable. Miss Marple stepped quite deliberately into his path. "Inspector Ramsay," she said, "I wonder if you might spare me a few minutes." He looked at her. She could see him making the standard assessment. Elderly lady, holiday visitor, probably wants to tell him something she heard at the post office. She watched him arrive at this conclusion and waited. "Of course," he said, with the courteous resignation of a man who has learned that dismissing elderly ladies occasionally costs him more time than listening to them. They walked to a bench on the seafront, which was empty at this hour. The sea was still calm. A herring gull sat on the seawall nearby and regarded them with magnificent indifference. Miss Marple sat down, arranged her coat and said, "I expect you know most of what I'm going to tell you, but I should like to tell you anyway, because there are one or two things I am fairly certain of that I don't think will have come out yet from the physical evidence alone." Ramsay looked at her properly for the first time. "You knew Sir Edmund?" "No. I arrived 4 days before he was found. I know nothing about him directly." She paused. But I have spent several days in conversation with a woman who I believe killed him, and I should like to tell you what I observed." A silence. The gull shifted on the wall. "Go on," said Ramsay. She told him everything. Not in the manner of someone who has been waiting for an audience. That was never her way. But methodically, clearly, beginning with the body on the shingle and ending with the tea room and the 3 seconds of silence. She told him about the photograph on the mantelpiece. The word difficult chosen over a dozen softer alternatives. The steady hand that had become, for one moment, unsteady. The question about the police inquiry that had been met with performed ignorance in a town where ignorance was not possible. She told him about Edward Collier's car on the Cliff Road. But she told him, and this she had been turning over since Thursday morning, fitting it into the larger shape, about the pause before the word quietly that Mrs. Fellows had made. The first evening when describing Sir Edmund's life at Heron Lodge. The small hesitation of someone who knew or suspected that quietly was not entirely the right word, but had decided to use it anyway. Ramsay listened without interrupting. He had, she was pleased to note, a small notebook in which he wrote occasionally, not constantly, which would have been the action of a man writing down everything, but selectively, which was the action of a man writing down what mattered. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Ashworth's husband," he said. "Did she tell you anything about him?" "Very little. He was much older. His heart was not strong. He died, I believe, 2 or 3 years ago." She paused. I did not press the point. It would have been noticed. Ramsay nodded slowly. "Mrs. Ashworth's husband," he said again, looking at the sea, "was a man called Peter Ashworth. He was tried 14 years ago for a serious fraud. Corporate fraud. A great deal of money involved. A great many people affected. Several of them, small investors, ordinary people, lost everything." He paused. "He was acquitted." Miss Marple looked at the sea. "The judge," she said, "was Sir Edmund Harcourt." "Yes." "And the acquittal was questioned, informally, never formally challenged. There were those who believed the verdict was influenced, nothing proven. Sir Edmund's reputation remained intact. Ramsay turned the notebook over in his hands. Peter Ashworth died 18 months after the acquittal. Heart failure, as Mrs. Ashworth told you. Vivian Ashworth received a considerable estate, though considerably less than it should have been, since the fraud proceedings, even with the acquittal, had damaged the business significantly. He paused. She lost a great deal of money. And before the money, she lost something else, we think. A brother, said Miss Marple. Ramsay looked at her sharply. Edward Collier, she said quietly. His name was different, but his face was not entirely. The shape of the jaw, the colouring. I thought it when I first met him, and then I set it aside because I wasn't sure, but yes, he is her brother. Or a half-brother, perhaps. Half-brother, said Ramsay after a moment. Yes, his mother remarried. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite respect, and was possibly both. He was one of the investors. A young man at the time had put in a modest amount, everything he had saved, lost it entirely. A brief pause. He never recovered professionally, has been rather unsettled since. Miss Marple sat quietly for a moment. So there it was. The shape that the knitting needles had been finding, row by careful row, for the past 4 days. A judge and a verdict and a life destroyed, 2 lives and a woman who had been close enough to the source of that destruction to know exactly where to find it, 14 years later, in a small seaside town. The letters, she said, in his desk. Yes. Ramsay's voice was careful. Several, from Mrs. Ashworth. Written over a period of, it appears, several months. They are not threatening letters exactly, but they are. He chose his word. They are letters that document a great deal. Her knowledge of the circumstances of the acquittal. Certain evidence, she implies, that she possesses. Correspondence between Sir Edmund and the defendant's legal team that she appears to have obtained. He paused. The final letter was written 3 weeks ago. It is the most direct. She was not blackmailing him, said Miss Marple. It was not a question. Ramsay looked at her. No, he said slowly. She was not asking for money. She was asking for acknowledgement, said Miss Marple. For admission. For him to say to someone, to anyone, what he had done, what the verdict had cost. A pause. That would be our reading of the letters. Ah, yes, said Ramsay. Miss Marple looked at the sea, the calm of it, the deep, indifferent patience of the water. She thought about a woman in a blue coat with grey-green eyes, and a face that had been arranged every day for a very long time. She thought about the photograph on the mantelpiece, the one that had not been put away, not even now, not even this week. She thought about that laugh, unguarded, real, captured in a summer nobody could reach anymore. She thought about the word difficult, chosen over a dozen softer ones. He refused, she said. We believe so, yes. There is no reply to the final letter in his desk, but the housekeeper, Mrs. Dove, has told us there was a meeting at Heron Lodge the Monday evening before he was found. Mrs. Ashworth was there. She left. Mrs. Dove did not see her leave. She had gone to bed. But she heard the door. Late, said Miss Marple. After midnight. The gull on the sea wall spread its wings suddenly, and then closed them again, as though it had changed its mind. The cause of death, said Miss Marple. We are still awaiting the full results. Ramsay paused. But the initial medical assessment has revised its position on natural causes. Another pause. There is bruising inconsistent with a simple fall, and the toxicology, we are waiting, but there are indications. Something in the glass, said Miss Marple quietly. Or the decanter, perhaps, before she left. Something that would take several hours. That would not. that would let her be gone and let it look like... She stopped. She is a composed person. She would have planned for the appearance of it. Ramsay said nothing for a moment. And then there is a decanter at Heron Lodge. It has been sent for analysis. Miss Marple nodded. She was very tired suddenly. Not the tiredness of the hip, or the tiredness of concentration, but something deeper and older than either. The tiredness that came always at this point when the shape was complete and the pieces had assembled themselves. And the thing that had been waiting to be known was known, and there was nothing left to do but sit with what it meant. It always meant too much. She is not a bad person, she said, and was surprised to hear herself say it, though she had been thinking it since Thursday at least. Ramsay looked at her. No, he said after a moment, I don't think she is. She is someone who has failed, said Miss Marple, by a system that was supposed to be just, and who waited a very long time and tried, at the end, to do the thing that a court of law should have done and did not. She paused. That does not make it right. I am quite clear that it does not make it right. But it makes it something other than simply wicked. And that is a distinction worth making, I think. Ramsay was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said, I think it is. She did not know afterwards exactly what she had expected the end of it to feel like. In books, and she had read a great many books, mysteries and otherwise, the solving of a crime had a certain quality of resolution, of completion. The pieces fitted together, the truth was established, and there was a rightness to it. Even if the truth was dark, even if the outcome was sad, there was the satisfaction of a thing properly finished. She had found, in her own long experience of such things, that the reality was different. The reality was a bench on a seafront on a grey Saturday morning, and a tired inspector with a notebook, and a gull on a sea wall, and the particular quality of knowing something that could not now be unknown, about a woman in a blue coat who had laughed once in a summer garden with a man who had, in the end, let her down in ways that could not be repaired. The sea kept what it kept, and the rest had to be given to the machinery of the law, which was imperfect, which had always been imperfect, which had been imperfect in ways that had caused all of this in the first place. Miss Marple sat for a while after Ramsay had gone. The gull eventually left too. She sat alone with the sound of the water and thought about justice. Real justice, not the legal kind, though that had its place and its necessity, and whether it was ever truly possible, or whether it was simply the thing that human beings went on reaching for, because the alternative, which was to stop reaching, was not something they were built for. She did not arrive at an answer. She rarely did on questions like that, and she had stopped, somewhere around her 75th year, expecting to. She got up slowly and straightened her coat and picked up her stick. There was one more thing to do, the quiet unravelling. She found Vivian at the church sale. Of all the places, of all the ordinary, impossible places, it was there. The church hall of St. Cuthbert's, which was 2 streets back from the seafront and smelled of old hymn books and recent baking, with long trestle tables covered in white cloths, and the particular cheerful clutter of donated china, and hand-knitted items, and second-hand paperbacks and jars of homemade jam, and a great many women of a certain age moving between the tables with the purposeful expressions of people engaged in serious commerce. Miss Marple had not planned to come here. She had walked from the seafront bench, after Ramsay had gone, with no particular destination in mind, simply walking, because walking helped, because her body needed something to do while her mind settled, and she had gone up the main street and turned without thinking at the corner by the post office, and had heard the sound of voices from the church hall, and had found herself, almost without deciding to, going in. She had been there perhaps 10 minutes. She had bought a jar of marmalade that looked promising and was examining a small watercolor of the harbour that was not very good but had a certain honest directness to it, when she looked up and saw Vivienne standing at the table across the room. She was looking at a set of teacups, blue and white, arranged on a tray, with the careful, appraising attention of someone who was not really looking at the teacups at all, but needed somewhere to put her eyes. She was wearing the pale grey coat from yesterday, and her hair was neat, and she was, as always, as unfailingly, composed, except that she was not quite. Miss Marple could see it from across the room. The same quality she had seen in the doorway of the tea room on Friday, the tiredness beneath the surface, but deeper now and less hidden. The set of the shoulders, the way she stood, very still, among all the movement of the sail, like a woman who has stopped in the middle of something and is not entirely sure how to start again. Miss Marple set down the watercolor. She crossed the room slowly, with her stick, navigating between tables and browsers with the patience of long practice, and came to stand beside Vivienne at the blue and white teacups, and looked at them for a moment without saying anything. Vivienne did not startle. She had heard the stick, most likely. She simply looked sideways once, and then looked back at the teacups. "Ah, Miss Marple," she said. Her voice was level, warm, still professional almost. "Mrs. Ashworth," said Miss Marple. A pause. Around them, the sale went on. A woman asking the price of a bread tin. Two children being steered away from a display of glass paperweights. The smell of tea brewing somewhere at the back. "These are nice," said Vivienne, indicating the teacups with a slight gesture that was very nearly natural. "The pattern is good. Someone took care with them." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "someone did." Another pause. Then Vivienne said, without looking at her, in a voice that was very quiet and very steady, and carried, beneath the steadiness, something that was not quite anything Miss Marple could name. Not distress, not defiance, not relief, but something that had elements of all three. "How long have you known?" Miss Marple considered the question honestly. "Since Wednesday morning," she said, with certainty. "Before that, since Monday evening, I think. Though I wouldn't have called it knowing then, more the shape of a possibility." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "I thought," she said carefully, "that you were simply a pleasant elderly lady on holiday." "I know," said Miss Marple. "That is generally what people think." Something crossed Vivienne's face. Not quite a smile, not quite its opposite. Something in between, and very tired. "I should have known better," she said. Edmund always said that the most dangerous person in any room was the one nobody was watching. The use of his name, Edmund, or not Sir Edmund, landed in the space between them with a quiet weight. Miss Marple did not remark upon it. "He was right," she said simply. They moved, by unspoken agreement, towards the quieter end of the hall, a corner near the door, away from the main tables, where two chairs had been left unoccupied beside a small table of donated books. They sat down, both of them, with the slightly careful movements of women for whom sitting down is a decision rather than a reflex, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Miss Marple put her marmalade in her bag and folded her hands on top of her stick and waited. Vivienne looked at her own hands. At the cream gloves she was wearing, the same cream gloves as Monday, which Miss Marple had noted and filed away as the habit of a woman who chose her things carefully and returned to them. I'm not going to tell you it was an accident, Vivian said. That would be insulting to both of us. Yes, said Miss Marple, it would. And I'm not going to tell you he deserved it. A pause. Though I have thought that. I won't pretend I haven't thought that many times. He did what he did for money, Miss Marple. Not conviction, not error of judgment, money. A very great deal of it, paid in ways that didn't leave traces. Her voice was even, factual almost. My husband was not a good man. I was not. I had no illusions about Peter by the end. But the people who trusted his company with their savings, who had nothing to do with anything except believing in something that should have been trustworthy, those people lost everything. And the man responsible for that walked out of court and had a very pleasant retirement and died in his own bed. And Sir Edmund, who had made it possible, retired to a comfortable house by the sea and had people to dinner. She stopped. Miss Marple said nothing. I wrote to him, Vivian said after a moment. Several times. I wasn't asking for money. I didn't want anything from him except I wanted him to say it to someone, to me, that he had known what he was doing, that he understood what it had cost. A brief pause. Edward lost everything he had saved. He was 26. He has never quite found his footing since. And there are others, many others, who are worse. Her voice tightened, very slightly, then released. I only wanted Edmund to say it. That is all I wanted. In the end. And he wouldn't, said Miss Marple. He was kind about it, in his way. That was almost the worst part. He was genuinely kind. He sat across from me in that room, and he said he understood why I felt the way I did, and that he was sorry for my losses, and that he had conducted himself according to the law as he understood it at the time, and that he wished me well. She said the last words with a care that was more devastating than anger would have been. He wished me well. And I knew then that that there was no version of this where he would simply say, yes, I did that. I knew what I was doing, and I did it, and I am sorry. Silence. The sounds of the church sale went on around them. Cheerful, indifferent, ordinary. The decanter, said Miss Marple quietly. Vivian looked at her hands. He offered me a drink, she said, before I left. A gesture, I think genuinely, of goodwill. He was not cruel, Miss Marple. That was the thing about him. He was not cruel. He had simply decided a long time ago that certain accommodations were necessary and had made his peace with that and had gone on living. A pause. I had been carrying it for a long time, what I brought with me that evening. Another pause, shorter. I did not decide finally until he wished me well. Miss Marple sat quietly for a long moment. She thought about a woman carrying something for a long time. She thought about the photograph on the mantelpiece, not put away, still there, on a Saturday morning when Vivian must have known, or at least suspected, that things were closing in. She thought about the decanter and the goodwill gesture and the particular cruelty of a man being genuinely kind to the person he had genuinely wronged. She thought about Edward Collier's car on the cliff road and the look across the dinner table, and whether he knew, had known all along, or had suspected, or had simply loved his sister and asked no questions he didn't want answered. She thought about justice, its imperfections, its necessity. She thought about a judge and a verdict and all the lives turned by it, like stones with the quiet indifference of power. The inspector, she said, Ramsay, he is a careful man. Vivian looked up. He will have the decanter by now, said Miss Marple, and the letters, and Mrs. Dove's account of Monday evening. She said it gently, factually, without performance. He is not an unkind man, I think, but he is thorough." Vivian looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were clear. That clarity Miss Marple had noticed from the very beginning. That quality of having looked at something difficult and chosen, with full knowledge of the cost, what to do. It was still there. It had not diminished. If anything, it was more present now than it had been at any point in the week, as though the weight of maintaining everything else had been set down, and only this remained. "I know," said Vivian quietly. "I think," said Miss Marple, "that you have known since Thursday at least that this was not, that it would not—" She paused, choosing her words. "I think you knew when you came to coffee on Thursday morning. I think you have known that it was a matter of time." Vivian said nothing for a moment, as then, "Yes, and you stayed," said Miss Marple. Not an accusation, simply an observation, quiet and wondering and entirely genuine. "Where would I go?" said Vivian, and there was something in the simplicity of it that was, Miss Marple felt, one of the most honest things she had said all week. Not resignation, not defeat, simply the plain truth of a woman who had done what she had done, and known what it meant, and decided that running was not the kind of person she was. Miss Marple looked at her. She thought, as she had thought on the seafront after Ramsay left, that she was not a bad person. She thought it more certainly now, having sat beside her in this ordinary hall full of ordinary donated things, having heard her speak about Edmund in that voice that carried still, beneath everything, at the remnant of something that had once been genuine. She thought that the law would do what the law did, and that Ramsay would be thorough and not unkind, and that whatever came after that would be, whatever it would be, out of her hands as it must be. She thought that being not a bad person and having done a terrible thing were not, in her experience, mutually exclusive. She had known that for a very long time. It was one of the things that made the work, if you could call it that, harder than it looked from the outside. She did not say any of this aloud. Is there anyone you would like called?" she asked instead. "Before, is there someone who should know?" Vivian looked at her, and for the first time in the entire week, in all the careful conversations and the managed expressions and the composed performances of grief and neighborliness and gracious living, her face did something unrehearsed. Not tears, she did not cry, but something in the eyes, that extraordinary, disciplined clarity, softened, briefly, into something that was simply human. Simply tired, simply the face of a woman at the end of a very long road, sitting in a church hall with donated teacups and the smell of hymn books, beside an old woman she had badly underestimated. "Edward," she said, "if you wouldn't mind." "Of course," said Miss Marple. She stayed until Ramsay came. He arrived quietly with a younger constable, not Norris, someone older, and was, as Miss Marple had predicted, careful and not unkind. He spoke to Vivian in a low voice, with the particular manner of a man who understands that he is dealing with a situation of some complexity, and is not in any hurry to make it worse. Vivian stood and was composed and went with him without difficulty. At the door she paused once and looked back at Miss Marple. She did not say anything. There was nothing really to say. She simply looked, a long, clear, final look, and then she went out through the door, and the constable followed, and that was that. Miss Marple sat for a moment longer in the chair beside the table of donated books. She was very tired. The genuine, complete tiredness of a thing finished. Her hip ached, her back ached, and she thought with some sincerity that Dr. Haydock was probably right about the sea air, and that she should have been doing more of it and less of everything else. She looked at the table of donated books beside her. There was a battered copy of a Gladys Mitchell, a P.G. Wodehouse with a broken spine, and, she noticed with a faint private amusement, an Agatha Christie. She could not see the title from where she sat, and did not lean forward to check. She picked up her marmalade and her stick and got to her feet, slowly, with the effort that getting to her feet required these days, and which she had learned to simply accept as the price of being upright. The church sale went on around her. Nobody had noticed anything. The woman was still asking about the bread tin. The children had found the glass paperweights again, and were being steered away from them for the second time. The tea at the back of the hall had been made and was being poured, and someone was laughing at something, and the ordinary life of the place went on with its ordinary indifferent continuity. Miss Marple stood for a moment in the middle of it all. She thought about St. Mary Mead, about her garden, which would be needing attention. The roses along the south wall were always difficult in spring, about her niece Raymond's wife, who had been meaning to visit and hadn't yet, about her own sitting room, with its particular quality of afternoon light, and her own chair, and her own teapot. She thought she would telephone Dr. Haydock this evening. Not to tell him what had happened, he would only be tiresome about it. Simply to tell him that the sea air had been very beneficial, and she thought she might come home on Monday. She walked to the door of the church hall, and out into the grey morning, and in the air off the water met her at the step, cold and salt and indifferent and real. She stood for a moment and breathed it in. Then she went home for lunch. The sea at Whitmore-on-Sea kept its counsel, as it always had. The shingle was grey and wet and honest. The gulls came back when the weather suited them. The town went on, smaller perhaps, for what it had lost and what it had learned, but going on as towns do. Miss Marple's marmalade, when she opened it 3 weeks later in St. Mary Mead, turned out to be exceptionally good. She made a note to write and say so, and then forgot, and then remembered again in June. But by then it seemed too late to bother. Some things she had always felt were simply enough in themselves.